Welcome to our third week of DES113 typography course. I'm Pia Bergholz, and we are going to continue your journey in the land of typography. And this week we are going to focus a little bit more on setting type. So last week we started talking a little bit more about font choices and how they affect the text that people are going to read. And so this week we're going to continue with that. Now the term setting type also refers back to the old art of printmaking and typesetting. And as we seen in our previous lectures, you remember the little bits of type that were set into blocks and then spaced accordingly, and then the print was making from there. So from that craft, the original craft of printmaking, we have the term typesetting. And even though we're not using those little blocks of type anymore, even though we are working on a computer, we use the terminology setting type. And so we say things like, this text is set in 10-point Helvetica or something like that, or with a certain leading. So whenever you hear me refer to setting type, it's basically just the choices and the selections that you're making in your software program. Okay, so for today's agenda, we're going to continue with the type rules that we started last week, and a lot of these apply to typesetting guides, and some of it is kind of a little bit of a review from last week as well, but we'll get into them a little bit deeper. We'll continue talking, warning you or alerting you to some rookie mistakes, so hopefully you can avoid those before they take root as bad habits. And we're going to talk more about organizing text and creating hierarchy, some of the finer details of type, including how to use special characters. And then we're going to finish up the lecture today with something a little bit different, but the art of designing monograms. All right, so as we get into checking out the rest of the rules of typography, let's think about our main goals as designers. And I've mentioned this before, but we talked last week about legibility and readability. So, and as we mentioned this, the message and being able to deliver that message well is the designer's job. And so when we are setting type and when we are making our type setting decisions, legibility and readability are foremost goals. So when we think about legibility, we want to think about, is the type large enough and distinct enough that the reader can discriminate individual words and letters, all right? So our type choices really influence that, and including the size of the type. And then the readability of the text, does it qualify? Does the quality of the page make it easy to read? Is it inviting? Is it pleasurable to the eye? And that's where more of our setting decisions come into play, and how we space things out. And we started talking about that a little bit last week, and we're going to continue some more this week. This quote right here from Urban Font usually was, when I found it, it related to fonts, but I decided to take the liberty to kind of tweak it a little bit and apply it to typesetting as well, because I think it kind of, the font choices influences this, but it kind of goes even further. So, so that's something to think about again as we are going through these rules of typography. So the best typesetting choices are when the readers notice the message and not the type. And there are times when the type should be noticed and it's there to catch our attention, but most of the time it's the message and the words that are that the type is delivering that we need to deliver and emphasize in some way. So let's keep that in the back of our mind. And that will also help you make sense of some of the rules that we're going to be talking about here. All right, so let's continue with our 19 rules of type. So we left off at number 4 before, and so now we are on rule number 5. And rule number 5 reads like this: for text type, use sizes that, according to legibility studies, prove to be the most readable. These sizes generally range from 8 to 12 points for text that is read from your hand. And we mentioned that in previous lectures as well. But here he adds, the range that we're reading from, and that's something that's important to think about. How is the audience going to read your text? Is it something that needs to be read at a distance, or is it something they're going to hold in their hand? Again, when we talk about digital applications, and we have a little bit more leeway there because they can zoom in and so forth. But when we're talking about printed type, we want to keep between the 8 to 12 point. Now remember how before in week 1 we talked about how point sizes are based on the X height of the letter, so that it appears very different from one typeface to another. And so you can't automatically decide what point size you're going to use until you have decided what font you're using. So think of that end use. Is it going to be print or digital? How is the audience going to view your text? How close will they be? And that can also determine what text you set in certain sizes, because at a certain distance you might want them to notice part of your design, some part of the text, and then you might need them to be closer to see some of the other information. Right, so rule number 6 kind of relates a little bit to rule number 3 or 4. I can't remember now which one it was, but this one says avoid using too many different type sizes and weights at the same time. And we talked before about using too many different type styles, right? I think that was rule number 3 actually, because it becomes confusing. And kind of the same thing when you're using different type sizes and type weights. You want to avoid using it within the text, but if you're having different pieces of text on your layout, on your project, you want to, again, try to limit those. And here it says that some experts recommend no more than 2 or 3 sizes. And it kind of depends on the content that you're presenting, depending on how many different pieces of information it is. But if we're talking just a basic layout, one size for display titles, for like headlines and so forth, one for text type, and then here it says one for disclaimers. Now if you have subtitles in there, you might need some in-between sizes right there, but try to keep them not too many different ones, because again, that reason for having different sizes, which is to create some hierarchy and create contrast. If there's too many, it just becomes washed out and blurred out, and you can't really tell what's what. So so that's important. It's also important that you stay consistent. So be sure to have at least 2 to 3 point size difference to have a clear contrast between your type sizes. So if you're wanting to make something larger, make it at least 2 to 3 points larger, so it really has the effect of being larger, rather than just looking like maybe you made a mistake. Rule number 7 talks about using different weights of text. And we talked about that last week as well, what the different weights of text are used for. So it says for text, use types of book weight. Avoid typefaces that appear too heavy or too light. Text typefaces that are too light are hard to see on the background. They can also be difficult whether it's a screen or when it's printed. And also when typefaces are too heavy, the counterforms or the openings inside of the letters make them smaller, and then it is less legible. So if we take a look and review some of the things we talked about last week, each type of weight of text in the same font will have similarities, but they have specific uses. So the regular, sometimes called book or Roman, is designed for readability and paragraph text. That's the one that you should use on body copy. Light or thin text is elegant and light, but again, it can be fine to read as long as it shows up with the background, and it kind of depends on the font how thin they are making those light weights. The bold or the black, or sometimes called heavy, are more for emphasis. They're louder, stronger, and again, harder to read, so not as good legibility for those bolder fonts. The italic or oblique fonts are more for emphasis, quotes, disclaimers. They have a quieter, gentler feel, but they can also add action and movement. And so they're not necessarily a weight of text, but they do have a specific use and should not be used for body copy. All right, so let's move on to rule number 8. Use typefaces of medium width. Avoid typefaces that appear extremely wide or narrow, and we talked about those different purposes of the more condensed and wider font as well. Condensed fonts are good sometimes when you need to try to pack in a lot of text in a less amount of space, and the wider ones really, kind of exaggerate things. But if you're looking for a narrow or a wider text, be careful not to stretch or squeeze the text width at all, but find a type family that includes a condensed or extended typefaces so that it will not have to be distorted to be used. So this refers back to rule number 17, which we talked about last week and which we're going to talk about again today, which is never to stretch or distort the type at all. So, and this here, I actually wanted to show a little demo on this because thing is, let's see, let's actually look at it here where we can see this text a little bit larger. And unfortunately, there are tools in Illustrator where you can actually stretch the text. You see these up here, and I almost kind of wish that they didn't even have these tools. I don't even know what they're for because they go against all of the rules and grains of any designer. But right here you can see that there is a vertical stretching and a horizontal stretching. And as let's actually look and see what happens to our text. Then it's similar to what would happen. Let's say that you want this text to fit into a certain area, and so you want it to be a little bit larger. And if you're an illustrator and you pull on this text box, it might just stretch the text. But in InDesign, you would actually, and maybe you can just do it with the text box. Let's see if it does it here. So you can actually just increase the height of the text like so, right? I'm just making it 125 instead. So I'm making it taller. But if you zoom in, you will see that it's distorting the shapes of these letters. They're not looking the way that they were intended to be. They get a little skinnier up here on top compared to the bottom, and the shape of the letter itself changes, right? So same thing if you if you do the stretching widthwise. Okay, now right now it's going to make the text too wide for our box as well. But you're also kind of stretching and distorting the type this way. So that's another no-no. If, there might be very few instances where this is your last resort, but much more beneficial to you is just to choose a font that is more narrow, or that has a condensed or narrow version to it, or an extended or wide version to it. So let's take these off of here because they are what we do not want to do. And so we'll take those off. All right, let's get back to our slides. So that's rule number 8. Do not distort anything, referring back to rule number 17. All right, so here are the font widths that you might be able to find instead. So if you find a condensed version, they're taller, tighter, they're space saving. Sometimes they really add a feel of elegance to the text, but they are harder to read. And many times the condensed versions come as almost like a separate font, so they will have other styles within them, like bold or italic or whatever inside of the condensed version. The wide, the extra, the extended, sometimes called black or ultra or poster, just the heavier ones. Depending on the font, they might have different characteristics to them. Like you can see this one here, the letter shapes are quite different from the regular font. They're very powerful and demanding and can be very effective, but usually you also lose a little bit of legibility in those fonts. All right, so let's continue on here. For rule number 9, we are talking about using letter and word spacing to get an even, uninterrupted texture and color. And we started talking about that color of text last week. We want letters to flow gracefully and naturally into words, and words into lines, which means that word spacing also increases proportionately as you are having larger letters. Now, these adjustments usually you don't have to make manually, but they're built into the computer software. But if you make any additional changes to that from the default settings, especially if you're working in InDesign, using the style sheets like the paragraph styles or the character styles is your friend. Because if you're making the changes in there, they're made throughout all of your text, and you don't have to try to remember what you highlighted, making sure you highlight certain things, and especially if you have several pages of text, it's really helpful. So make sure that you take advantage of those styles, the paragraph styles, specifically when you're talking about letter spacing and word spacing, so that everything can stay consistent for you. This consistency is really what creates a good text flow, or what we can also call fluidity of content. And that's very important when it comes to reading, especially body copy or bigger amounts of text. We really need, that's kind of why we've started talking about the letter and then words and lines and paragraphs, because that's how it's all affected. The letters need to flow nicely together with the other letters. Each word needs to flow nicely from word to word. Then the text needs to flow nicely from line to line, and from paragraph to paragraph, and from column to column, and page to page. And all of these different rules and things that we are talking about, they are just there to ensure this, that the text flows nicely, that there's breaks where you need to pause, that there's emphasis where you need to notice it, that there are that there are consistencies, so you understand what text belongs to another part of text and where you should continue reading or where you need to stop reading, or different parts that need to grasp your attention. So this flow of the text, or fluidity of content, that's the goal, and that's where all of these rules and suggestions and directions are aiming to. So that's why consistency is so important, is because if you're not keeping consistent, you start out a person feeling like this is what they need to get used to, this is what it's looking like, and this is what my brain is registering. And then when you're changing things, even any change will mark that there's also a change in meaning or a change in content and that kind of stuff. And so if you don't stay consistent, well, people get used to, like, oh, this is my subheader, this always looks like this, or this is the way that something is aligned, some text is aligned. If it changes throughout the copy, the brain becomes confused, then it's not as easy to just follow the text. And remember, the reader should get the message, not have to look at the text. So you want to consider the font size and the tracking and the leading, the things that we talked about before. Also the spacing that creates the color of the text, and also paragraph divisions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about paragraph divisions when we get into rule number 14. Along with this fluidity of content and readability and all of these different things is our line lengths. So you want to use appropriate line lengths. Lines that are too short or too long are difficult to read. And sometimes when you talk about text type, they suggest a medium column width, which is about 70 characters, or an alphabet long, people sometimes say. It's usually the most comfortable one for people to read. But keep in mind, again, when you have dynamic text like you do on a website, that really isn't under your control. So this mostly applies to print. And there's also times when you can create your own line breaks, and because of the content, you will create specific emphasis and things like that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk into organizing text. So sometimes you might actually take this rule and break it on purpose to create a certain type of emphasis. So let's look at this little bit of text again and look at the line length. Now here we have it kind of zoomed in, we have a page of text, and when you're looking at something on the screen, it's never quite realistic because it's not always the size that you're going to look at it if it's intended to be a printed piece. But we have this piece of text right here, and our line length, let's see what size this type is first, maybe. So it's 10-point size, so kind of an average text body copy size. And the text box goes from one end of the margin to the other end of the margin. So these are pretty long lines. So they're, probably about 7.5 inches long. And you can actually in the information panel over here, you can actually highlight your text and see how many words you have on a line. So right here you can see there's 123 characters, so almost twice as many as suggested, 21 words. Okay, so that info panel can help you. So you can be specific there as you need to be, but most of the time it is just helpful to just have some columns in your document, and that will help you kind of realize the width of your text. So here for this one here, if we choose to have this document instead have 2 columns. And we align our text boxes with that. So we have just kind of half a page worth of text. Let's see, that would be, now we have about 57 characters. So that's, you know, that's on the lower end of medium. So that's pretty comfortable to read. Now, once you start having a 3-column grid, it sometimes becomes a little bit harder for your line lengths. So if I make this a 3-column grid, we have 3 different columns to put our text in now, and I keep my text within this 1 column, it starts getting a little bit shorter. And when you can only get like 3 or maybe 4 words on each line, that becomes a little bit harder to read and harder to kind of just connect each line to the next. So if you have, 3 columns in a grid, my suggestion is that you actually fill 2 of those columns with text and leave the other one for whatever you might just, white space or images or captions or something. And then you have a pretty nice line length right here. So this one here, if we highlight it, you can see it's 81 characters. So that's right about perfect, comfortable read right there. So I would say keep to either, for your regular pages, keep either a 2-column grid and use 1 column, or if you're having a 3-column grid, maybe keep the body of the text. Now, other pieces of text like small information or captions and things like that can easily be put in a skinnier column. But the body of the text, if it goes over 2 columns, then that becomes more easy to read. One thing that you want to think of when you are doing this also is that you want to have consistent column width for your text. So if you have the same story and you have part of it in this long of line length and then part of it in a shorter line length in a skinnier column, then that is going to really kind of mess with the fluidity of that content, because people become accustomed to reading something at a certain line length, and then part of it is going to be in a shorter line length, and that really disrupts the flow of that text. So try to keep consistent line length and column widths in your body copy. Okay, so continuing talking about line breaks, here's some text that has some pretty medium length lines, because this text is a little bit larger. So keep that in mind too, that the larger your text is, the more characters you'll have per line and the longer your lines can be. So kind of reverting back to this right here, if this was text that was set much larger, so right now it is 10 point, I believe, right? So if this was for some reason a 14-point text, well, then the lines are not going to feel quite as long, because you don't have as many characters and you don't get, kind of as far into the sentences as when you have to move down to the next line. Same thing if it's if you have a very narrow line length and a larger font, you're going to be able to fit even fewer words on a line. So right here you can see there's only 2 words on that line, and that becomes kind of difficult as well. Yeah, so let's go back here and let's talk about making logical places for your line breaks. And so that's not something that you can always go in and take care of when it comes to your body copy, because you'll have so many places and so much text that it's impossible to go in and fix all of that. But when you have larger pieces of text and you need to make some type of line break, try to make that break where it flows naturally in the content of the text. So like right after a comma, for example, or right around one of the kind of connecting words like but and things like that. Try to be careful so that you don't split up the and the word that it's defining. So try to really read through your text when you are having to make specific line breaks, manual line breaks, so that happens in a good spot. And try to avoid too many hyphenations and things like that. Also try to avoid orphans and widows. So orphans and widows, let's see, I think we're going to talk about those a little bit later. Yep. But orphans and widows are single words that land on a line by themselves, and they become distracting as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few slides here. Okay, rule number 11. For text type, use line spacing that easily carries the eye from one line to the next. Lines of type with too little space between them slow the reading process, but by opening up the types, so in other words, adding 1 to 4 points of leading, readability can be improved. And this we started talking about last week when we talked about the color of text. And you know, the spacing settings, the tracking and the leading can really affect both the readability of your text, but also affect the mood and the way that a person kind of perceives the text and the mood that they get from the text. So let's take a little closer look at that as well. All right, so here you can see two pieces of text of the same size, but with different leading. The first one is Helvetica 10/12. Remember how we have that fraction there, mean the first number is the point size and the second number is the leading. And so the first one is set 10/12. And the second one has added a couple of points of leading, so it is 10/14. And you can see how, you know, it does kind of add a little bit of air to it. It doesn't feel quite as dense and sometimes not as intimidating to read, but it does take up more space. So you'll need to be, you know, factor that in as well when you are deciding things, depending on if you have limited space and things like that, where the text is going to fit. But there are some adjustments that you can do so that the text does not feel, you know, too dense and too heavy to read. Even if it's not a lot of text, for some reason, text that's set really tight seems a little bit intimidating and like a lot of work to read. So you want to be careful with that. So let's take a look at a couple of ways that setting the color, that you can kind of change the color or the mood of the text through leading and kerning. And that should not be leading and kerning, that should be tracking. There we go. All right, so, because kerning is what? That's the space between two specific characters, right? And the tracking is the text in general, so kerning would apply to this. All right, so we have our basic here. We have the specs for it right here, 10/12, and we've copied it in a couple of different 3 other places. So we're going to make changes to this and see how you feel about the text with the new settings. So if we, for example, add more leading to this text, and if I would be happy if it would just kind of, let's see, let's move these down so that we have plenty of space to work with here should we need it. So let's work with our with our leading right here and see what happens to our text. So as we keep opening it up, you can see that again, you know, it starts feeling a little lighter, a little bit more open, but it gets to a point where when it's so open that it becomes really kind of hard to connect one line to another. So you want to have that sweet spot that's right in between too tight and too wide. And usually you have a few point sizes to kind of play with right there. And you will notice when you are setting a lot of text that your leading is going to change how much text you fit on a page very quickly. So that's one way. Now, if we add some tracking to this text as well, so we space the letters out as well, you will start to see here how it really changes where the hyphens go and where the how the rag looks. But we kind of have to go up quite a bit before we feel like it really makes a difference in reading the text. But right now you can see if we just compare these two, this text feels a little bit more open and not quite as intimidating, maybe a little bit easier to read than this kind of dense part right here. But again, there is that sweet spot, because if we go up and we make the spacing way wide, then again, it becomes more difficult to connect the words, and it becomes really chopped up, and each one of the individual letters are separated from the others, and it becomes just more difficult to read. One thing that this can do, though, depending, and I wouldn't recommend it when it comes to body copy, but if you just have a sentence or two, like here, for example, and this is something that you can take advantage of in advertising, for example. So let's say we just have this much text, or even if we only have, let's only have one line of text. Okay, let's just take this part of the text right here, and let's put it by itself. Okay, so we're looking at here the color and the mood of the text, right? And if you change the tracking of this text, so if we tighten it up, it's going to feel more cramped. It's going to feel kind of agitated and a little bit of cramped. If you open up the text and you have the letters very far apart, all of a sudden you're going to get more of a feeling of kind of luxury. I'm going to take this off so it doesn't distract us, of luxury and space and a little bit more elegance, right? Now, on top of that, if I made that text light, let's see, Myriad Pro doesn't have a light version. Let me make it condensed, maybe. And so it's tall and skinny, and then even further apart. You know, you start get a different feel for what these words mean. Right now, you kind of get a more like elegant and opulent feeling for the words than they were to begin with. So the spacing of the text really, gives you control over how the reader is going to receive your message. And you will notice this a lot in advertising. And so, I challenge you to look around and look at advertising. And anytime they want something to be maybe luxurious or elegant or exclusive, they use this technique of having a lot of space between the letters so that it feels like it's kind of open and that it's more exclusive. And subconsciously, this is because space is real estate when it comes to advertising. And so space costs money. And if you can afford to use that space, not have to cram things into it, but you can use that, you have plenty of space to build your castle on, so to speak, it gives more of a sense of luxury. You can kind of compare it to a house that's built on a large lot. You have a lot of space around it compared to one that is crammed in a very tight subdivision or row houses or something, right? It will feel more luxurious when it has all of that space around it. Same thing with text. So kind of think about that and look at that when you look at advertisement and see if they're using, I think luxury vehicles, cosmetics, all kinds of other more luxury type items will use this technique to make their product feel calmer, more exclusive, and more luxurious. Now, if you are tightening up text and you are fitting a ton of stuff into a little small piece of real estate, so to speak, publishing real estate, printed real estate, it's going to look cheaper just because it's kind of like you can't only afford this tiny little bit of space and you're trying to cram everything in there. And so, yeah, so there we go. That's one of the ways that you can really change the mood and the color of text. Now, let's compare down here these two a little bit more also. And see what happens when we tighten things up. So if we tighten this leading instead, making it pretty tight like that, you can see it's efficient, right? You get a lot of text into a little bit of space, but it's also going to feel, cramped and economized, like you just don't have much to work with. So those are some ways that you can really affect the reading and the text. Now you can also add tracking to text without adding the leading. So if we just add some tracking to this text, but no additional leading, let's see, this one here is 50. And so let's do 50 here too. We can compare. So now we have the same distance between each one of the characters, but we haven't added the leading. And when we only add tracking and not leading, that problem with the words not holding together is actually a little bit emphasized, because if we zoom in here, you will see that the proximity between this E and a letter below it is going to be closer. And so when it's further away, both from the words, the letter forms side by side and the ones up and down, then your brain is not really holding that word together as well. And up here, even though the letters are at the same distance to each other, there's more distance to the words below and above. And so it's easier to just kind of keep this contained and keep these letter forms contained to themselves. So if you're adding tracking, you should also add some leading to help keep those words kind of holding together. Okay, so hopefully that all kind of makes sense why we have those rules there, and what you should think about when you're changing the leading and the tracking of the text. And you can do it either to your advantage, or if you're not careful and don't think through it, it could be to your disadvantage. Right, let's go back and continue with our rules here. All right, so rule number 12. In rule number 12, we're talking again about readability, and we are referring to alignment now. Using a flush left, ragged right type of alignment is easiest to read. There's other situations where you can use other alignments like flush right or centered or justified. But we always have a little bit of a trade-off when it comes to readability. Now, to remind you of the different types of alignments, we have left alignment, which you can see here where everything is aligned to the left, and you have that ragged right, like the rule mentioned. There's a justified alignment where you have text on the text aligned on both sides, and you have center alignment where it's just lined up to the center and you have uneven ends on both sides, and then you have right alignment where everything is lined to the right edge and you have kind of a rag on the left. And this one becomes difficult just in our Western way of reading because we start left to right. So we kind of have to search for each line where it starts, and that kind of messes with us. So that's not good to use for longer paragraphs of text, but it works fine for small things when you want to create specific emphasis, or if you have it as a caption to an image or something like that. The left alignment and the justified alignments are the ones that are most commonly used for body copy and text. Center alignment should be reserved only for things where each line can kind of stand alone a little bit more on its own. So it should be reserved for things like poetry or lyrics, or in certain instances when you have small amounts of information that kind of needs to be separated, a center alignment can help you there. But then a lot of times you have to go in and make those specific line breaks yourself. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about organizing text. But let's take a look at both the left alignment and the justified alignment and some of the issues that you might run into when it comes to readability and how you can remedy those. Whoops. Let's go back to our screen here. All right, we're actually going to look here. Let's go back to these paragraphs of text right here. Okay, so let's take a look at these paragraphs that we were playing with earlier as well here. Let's see kind of what happens with some of the lines and how they're how the text is being hyphenated when we're using some of these different alignments. When you're having your left alignment right here, you will notice that you get kind of a rag over here on the side, and you want that not to be too disruptive. If you're using hyphenations, it will help that rag. If you don't hyphenate, you'll get a more drastic change in your rags right there. And so hyphenation will help. Sometimes, you will get a lot of words that are hyphenated in a row, which is not so nice. That just kind of becomes difficult to read. But again, your line length will also affect that. So of course, if you have a narrower line length, you're going to have more uneven rhythm on the other side. And you're going to, even if you do not hyphenate at all, that didn't even make any difference in my hyphenations. I would think that there would be some more hyphens when I made a narrower column, but then you can see that, this unevenness of this, of the rag end becomes difficult. So a lot of times if you have really narrow columns, you might prefer to do a justified typesetting so that you don't get those rags, but instead you kind of opt for having it be inserted into the text instead. And so then you have these kind of really wide, strange spaces right here that happen when the software program is trying to equalize your line lengths. And that can also be very distractive. It's usually called that there's rivers in your text, because you can kind of see how, you could kind of float through the text right here in specific places. And so that's something that is not very attractive when it comes to text. Depending on your settings, sometimes it also starts to kind of stretch words out a little bit, like you could see here in our PowerPoint example. You can see right here how these words are spaced further apart, and that's something automatic that happens within the software program when you're trying to do the justified text. So when you do justified text, most of the time you actually have to go in and make some kind of adjustments to it to make sure that it fits within your, that you don't have so much trouble and it fits well within your column width. So I would suggest you kind of keep that for a little bit longer lines, but you can also adjust your tracking to kind of see what happens and see if it changes these rivers a little bit. So let's pull it back like here to where we had all those rivers, and let's add a little bit of tracking to see what happens if we let there be a little bit more space between each one of the letters. Usually that will kind of even out those rivers and that spacing. So that's one way that you can kind of try to get rid of that. And then hyphenation, again, is also important when you are trying to even out the spacing between the letters. You can see if we don't allow hyphens, this just must not have a lot of hyphens in this placement text here, because that doesn't really change things a lot there either, does it? With the hyphens or without the hyphens. All right, so that is your that's your justified versus your left aligned text. If you're also, some other things to think about, if you're using justified, you want to be sure that you choose on purpose where the last line goes. This one right here, as you can see in the little icon right here, the last line is aligned left, which is the one that you would probably mostly prefer, because you read from left to right, so that last line doesn't feel awkward. If you put it to centered, then you have more of a centered orientation of all of your text, which may or may not be suitable for that. And of course, the last line aligned left will give you kind of a different orientation towards the end. And if you have all lines justified, then you will see that it actually stretches out these three words across the whole last line, which also becomes a little bit, it's difficult for the flow of the text, for one thing. So those are your justified settings. Let's, I think rule number 13 is kind of take us to the next step here. And this one talks about if you have a left alignment, or maybe possibly a right alignment as well. But it says to strive for consistent rhythmic rags. The purpose of effective rags is not only to achieve an aesthetic beauty, but also help the reader move gently and effortlessly down the text column. Effective rags consist of lines establishing an informal but consistent pattern of line endings. And again, you can adjust that through hyphenation options or your tracking. So let's take a look at our left aligned text right here. I'm going to put that back to this because it's bothering me. But we can look at this left aligned text here. Let's actually look at this one here where we can see the narrow end a little bit. And as I just barely went over, you can see how the line length changes, how much of a rag you get. The hyphenation should also, but I'm not really sure why this text is not reacting to hyphens. But you want to have a ragged end that's not too drastic. And again, if you're starting to feel like you have quite a bit of, you can see this piece of text right here, it goes in here, it has like a big indent for several lines in a row, and then they come out again, and then they come in again. So that feels a little bit uncomfortable to me. It really makes this text block have kind of a strange shape right here where all of this goes in. It would seem to me like hyphenation should help with that, but for some reason it's not hyphenating. But you can also change it with your letter spacing then. And we have already added some to this. So let's see what it would look like if we didn't have any. Then that would change kind of the shape of the rags and the text. So it's kind of bothering me that I can't show you about the change that the hyphens are doing. So let's see if it will help us in this InDesign document instead. All right, so let's take a look at this piece of text right here. Let's take it down to medium line length. And we have it is justified right now. That's the justified alignment that it is. If we change it to the left aligned, then you'll see you start getting some of those rags right there. And we have hyphens on. So let's take off the hyphens. There you go. Now you can really see a difference. You can see that it's, let's take off our, whoops, not so much so. Let's just take off our guides here so it's a little bit easier to see. But now you can see that, you know, it kind of, this is kind of strange as well because now it kind of becomes an angle right here on your rags. But the second paragraph looks pretty good. It's kind of just even and flows in and out a little bit. But when your rags become either at a certain angle or have big curves and stuff in it, you want to kind of try to avoid that and see if there's something you can do to fix that. So if I choose this text now and I hyphenate it, you can see that that fixed that. Now we have a lot more even line lengths below and above each other. So it feels a little bit more rhythmic and nice. And then you can, again, like we talked about, if you want to change your tracking here, if you wanted to add a little bit of tracking to it, it might change your rags as well to make them look different. But it could also run you into some other issues. So with typesetting decisions and choices like this, it's always kind of a give and take. When you start making changes to your settings, either where it's just manually like this or in your paragraph styles, you will notice how it affects all kinds of text that you have. And there's going to be places where it's maybe helping the text, and then down in a different place, it's causing problems in the text. So it's always a matter of just kind of evaluating and seeing what's your priority, what's your most sensitive to, what's going to be the thing that really impairs your reading or your readability the most, and try to overcome those issues. Most of the time, if you're dealing with a lot of body copy, you're not going to be able to get everything perfect, and so you're going to have to compromise in certain places. All right, so that was our rags. Now let's take a little bit of a look at paragraphs. So rule number 14 talks about paragraph separations. This one says clearly indicate paragraphs, but be careful not to upset the integrity and visual consistency of the text. The two most common ways to indicate paragraphs are indenting or inserting additional space between paragraphs. And when you are when you have a lot of text, or when you're using your word processor and you're writing your papers for your other classes, or you're writing correspondence and things like that, you might have certain formatting settings that tells you to do certain things. You should have, you know, this big of an indent on the first line of every new paragraph and things like that. And you probably also have a lot longer line lengths in those papers and documents than you would when you are setting type for a type of publication or for media of some sort. So this is where the rules are different for aesthetic type, or type that you're setting for publications, and when you are just typing and writing like a paper, and you're going for the formatting standards of, say, APA formatting. or Chicago style formatting or something like that. So, and that's something that you kind of have to unlearn when you're setting type for commercial purposes, is you have to not carry with you some of those settings and standards that are for academic papers and perhaps correspondence. So changing paragraphs is different when you're talking about publication and information design. And most of the time, spacing is preferred to having a first line indent on your text, because it gives the reader a little bit more of a break. I think first line indents are more common when you're talking about textbooks or novels or something like that, where you really are needing to try to condense the text into as little space as possible. But whenever you have a chance and whenever you have room to add a little bit space between your paragraphs instead, I would recommend you do that. It gives the reader a better break, and it tends to kind of just keep the alignment of the text nice and neat. One of the common rookie mistakes is to keep that first line indent too large. So you're keeping it with like your academic paper formatting. So with body copy, you want to kind of make that indent a little bit smaller so that it doesn't disrupt the text so much. And you also want to think about the relationship between your first line indent and your line length. Because if your first line indent is very wide and you don't have a very long line length, you're going to just kind of push that first line, the text on that first line, so that you may only have like a word or two on one line. And again, like we talked about, you want to have that, you want to have, about 15 to 20 words on the line for it to be comfortable to read. Another thing that happens kind of often before you get have a little bit more experience with setting type is using more than one indication of paragraph indication. So if you're using space, for example, if you're having space between your paragraphs, you don't need to do the first line indent, because you only need to separate the paragraphs in one way. And as soon as you have told your audience that now it's a new paragraph, either by adding space or adding that first line indent or adding a drop cap or something like that, then you have already told them it's a new paragraph. There's no sense in using both. Drop caps or enlarged caps, they should only really be used for the beginning paragraph and not for every single paragraph in a document. To kind of better illustrate this, let's go back to our InDesign document here. Let's go back to this one here. You can see in this one here some added space there's been added space between the paragraphs. It kind of looks nice with this justified alignment and whatnot. Let's say, for example, you want to have a drop cap. And if you start here, and I think that this one is set with paragraph styles, so we might have to go into the paragraph styles to make these changes. We'll move it back in here and just open it. So we can see there's actually a drop cap paragraph style in here. So let's see. Actually, I'm going to use this document here instead because it doesn't have any prior settings, so it's going to be a little bit easier for us to work with. So I've just put placeholder text into this text column right here. And you can see that as default, it doesn't have any kind of paragraph separations at all. There isn't even a return, which you might have depending on where you get the text from, it might be imported from your Word document returns that are in there. So here we see everything is aligned really neatly on the left side, but it feels pretty overwhelming, and we don't quite know where our paragraphs, where the switch in paragraphs are. But if we take, if we go to our paragraph panel, and we use the first line indent, this here, the first one right here will indent all of our text, so you can see it just indents it from the margin right there. But if we take the second one up, then we can indent just the first line. And so if I indent it, one of the first increments, which is 1.25, that gives me probably enough of an indentation that as I'm looking at this page, I can find out where those different paragraphs are. But you can also see that it kind of disrupts our nice, even alignment over here. And if I make that indentation quite wide, I need to select our text here. If I make it really wide, then it's really going to disrupt the flow of the text. And you can see these white spots here in the text becomes very noticeable. And then, like I mentioned also, if it's a narrower column, then it's going to give us not very many letters on that first line. And it becomes kind of difficult and arbitrary to look at and to try to read, even if we zoom in on it right there a little bit. But that might be your option if you don't have a lot of room in your text and you need to save space, but I would suggest you keep it under 1/2 inch, maybe 3.75 or 0.25 or 0.125 is enough. You know, that's actually kind of a nice little indentation right there. Now, so the other way to add the space between the paragraphs, add a paragraph separation, is to add some space between the paragraphs. And that in InDesign, you would actually have to do in paragraph styles. You can, of course, go in and make a return, but sometimes that ends up being a little too abrupt and a little bit too much space, and you don't have as much control over it. So if you go into your paragraph styles, and you go into the body copy here, which I'm assuming we are going to call this our, that was the imported one. Let's start a new one. Okay, and let's have this be the paragraph style for this new text. And if we open that up and take a look at some of the settings and options right here, with the preview down here selected, we can look at it. Under indents and spacing, this is where you can change your alignment as well. You can see how that changes it right there. But and you can add the indents here also. You can see that it transferred over what I had put in there. So it says that the first line indent is 1.25. But I can also add space before or after my different paragraphs. So if I add a little bit of space after each paragraph, you will see how it bumps down the next paragraph just a little bit, right? And so you can go in there and just be very accurate with that separation. But that now gives us even better separation than just the indent. But if you have both the space and the indent, then you're really interrupting kind of the flow and the edge of the alignment right here. So if you have space, you don't need the first line indent. So I'm going to take that off. And now you can see that the paragraphs are separated pretty easily. The text still flows pretty nicely, and you still have a good alignment to the left right there. So I think whenever you have a chance and you're able to just use spacing, do that, and then you can actually go in and adjust that spacing very carefully. Now we mentioned if you're using a drop cap, not to use that on every single on every single paragraph, but on the first paragraph only. And so actually, let's take a look and see how it would affect this piece of text if we added drop caps. So let's go back into the paragraph style here that we have. Oh, let's see. I always want to be able to see the document at the same time as we have that panel open, and it's always so big. So, so now that kind of helps a little bit. So let's go under drop caps and nested styles right here. We can take a look at that, and we can, if we add a drop cap of, let's say, 2 lines, then you see if it adds it to every single paragraph, then again we get kind of that that interruption again. And if every single paragraph starts with a drop cap, soon we start noticing the drop caps so much through the whole entire document that it becomes really distracting. And sometimes it even ends up that all of these capitals end up almost spelling a word or making something seem a little bit more like an acronym for something, and it becomes really distracting. So let's take that off of our text here for now. And let's see, can I take that off there now? It's not choosing my having a little bit hard time selecting things here, isn't it? Let's do Command Z and see if that helps. There we go. All right, so let's continue with our next rule and see how we can apply that to our text. All right, so this extra paragraph rule that we're throwing in here talks about subheadings and adjusting the subheadings to have a closer proximity or a tighter line spacing to the paragraph it's associated with rather than the preceding paragraph. If you have even spacing, that will make the connections unclear. And this is another one of those kind of rookie mistakes, is to have either inconsistent spacing after paragraphs, or that you kind of set your subheading right in the middle and right between 2 paragraphs. And you can actually make those changes also in the same place that we looked at right now, where you do the first indent before or after. And now I need to put in some subheadings right here for this to be effective. So let's say I put in a subheading right here, and I'm going to make it all caps so we can kind of tell it apart. Okay, I'm going to put this one in here too. And actually, you don't have to have a subheading between every paragraph. So let's take that one out and put one in here instead. Okay, so when we have added a couple of subheadings into our text, you can see that when I put it in here with a return, it spaced it evenly between this paragraph and this paragraph. And let me actually make them bolded so that it feels like a little bit easier to tell apart from the rest of the text. Okay, so now they're sitting right in between. And because we read from top to bottom, we kind of make the assumption that this subheading connects with this following paragraph, and this one connects with the following paragraph. But if you have a little bit more distance between the previous paragraph and the subheading than you do to the one that it connects with, it makes better sense, and it makes a more logical connection when it comes to proximity. And so those changes you can make either by, you can, if you have the room, you can always do an extra space. That might be a little drastic though. So going in, and if you create a specific paragraph style for your subheading, you can add that to it. So if we do here and we create this, our subheading paragraph style, I can't spell it very well here. And then for this, for the indents and spacing on this one, now we're having these problems again with InDesign not wanting to choose the, there we go. Then if I add a space before or after right here, then that will separate it from the other paragraph as well. So now I can put in a little bit of space before right here, and you will see how it drops it down away from the previous paragraph, and then it will be closer to the next paragraph. So let me just call that good. And then I can always apply that same subheading to the next one. Whoop. And you can see that then it moves that one down as well. So now if we look at the text, it's very clear that this subheading leads up these two paragraphs, and this subheading leads up this longer paragraph down here. And this is especially nice if you have a subheading that includes a couple of different paragraphs, and that way it really sections off the text easy, much more easier for the audience to read. All right, so the next rule is avoid orphans, widows and orphans whenever possible. And so the description of this is that the widow is a word or very short line at either the beginning or end of a paragraph. An orphan is a single syllable at the end of a paragraph, but also defined as a lone last line of a paragraph that moves over to the next column page. The word orphan seems to have a little bit of a different definition, depending on, I guess, who's saying it. But a widow is pretty clearly a word or a partial word or a very short line, maybe two short words or something like that at the end of a paragraph. So right here you have an example of a widow. The word readability right here is a widow. And what happens when you have a widow, especially in a lot of text, is that, again, it creates that uneven rag because you have this really long space at the very end. And when you have all of that white space right there, it actually puts a lot of emphasis and I'm losing my word here, emphasis and contrast to this very last word. So it becomes very noticeable. And usually in the text, the last word isn't that important. And so it kind of distracts from the rest of the paragraph that so much emphasis or focus was the word I was looking for, focus is on that last word. So we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Same thing for orphans. If you have just one line of a sentence that moves over to the next column or page of your text, again, that just kind of sits there all by itself. And then let's pretend that there was more text that followed below here. And then it just kind of cuts off the context of the reading, and it sits up there all by itself, and it gets all of that undue attention. So you want to try to avoid that because it kind of puts attention where it was not intended in the message. Widows and orphans are not always possible to avoid. There are sometimes where you just have to accept that there's going to be some. If we look at this column of text, for example, right here, there's one, right? But if I try to get rid of this one orphan, let's see what happens, because you can try, but the more text you have, the more opportunities for other orphans or widows to show up, or for you to run out of space or something else if you start trying to solve these widows. But if you have just a little bit of text, you're usually able to fix it. But let's see what happens if I try some of the techniques, and we can see if maybe we can resolve this widow right here. So one of the techniques can be to change your font size. If that's a possibility for you, you can change your font size either up or down, and maybe that will see what happens if I was going to just do 1 point. But just do 1 point smaller font, that surely took care of it in a hurry. It also saved me quite a bit of room for the text in this column. If you noticed before, it was actually running out of this text box here, but I wasn't too worried about it because that's not what our demonstration was about. But now you have a lot more space just by making the text 1 point smaller. If we go back to where it was and we add maybe a little bit of tracking, that could maybe help as well. You know, if the text is taking up more space on a line, then after a while it's going to bump some of those words over to the next line. So that took care of it for me right there. But it also made it again so that my text doesn't fit within this column if that was something that I needed to have. So let's take that back. Now, would leading make any difference when you are trying to change to avoid a widow or eliminate a widow? Not really, right? Because they're already set on the lines that they are. So if I add leading, that widow is going to stay where it is. It's the amount of text on each line that can help you avoid these. So with that in mind, if you don't already have your hyphenations on, then that might help you out. Might change. Didn't change much for my widow right there if I changed the hyphenation. If you have the flexibility of making your text box wider, you can try that, because usually you get fewer widows the wider your text box is, because it has more space. But look what happened down here. I created a widow down here instead. I eliminated the one up here, but I created the one down here. So usually, you know, sometimes that doesn't even help. So basically, you can try those different things. You can try changing the line width if you have the flexibility to do that. The tracking is usually the easiest way and the least intrusive way to try to eliminate a widow, because tracking usually doesn't, it makes a pretty big difference, but it's not that noticeable in the text. But whenever you're making any kind of changes like this to your text to avoid a widow or an orphan, make sure you make your changes in the style, you know, and that you have certain styles applied to your text, because otherwise, you know, you might be changing it in one part of the text, but not in another part of the text. And then again, you lose that consistency and that fluidity of content. So your text is going to be more difficult and feel inconsistent and unprofessional to read. All right, well, moving on to rule number 16. When you are emphasizing elements within the text, do that with discretion and try not to disturb the flow of reading. So you can use italics, you can use underline type, you can use color, different typefaces, capitals, bold type, or larger type to emphasize elements. But be careful not to overdo it. Underline type, I would try to avoid, because any more underline type seems to also indicate that it's a link, especially if you're doing something digitally. So I would avoid that. The other thing that happens when you have underlined type is that it starts interfering with your line spacing. You have an added element to the text, which kind of makes it feel cluttered. And so I would really avoid underlining type. But you can use italics or bold type. That's probably the least intrusive way to add emphasis. If you have the opportunity to add color, you can always do that. If you start using a different typeface or larger type, be sure that you remember that it can also affect the leading of the text. So it can kind of start wreaking havoc all the way through your text. And capitals can be used as well, but again, like we mentioned before about all caps, it can sometimes seem like you're yelling, and are you sure that's the message you want to bring? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the italics and the bold are pretty safe ways to emphasize things. The underlying rule when it comes to emphasizing elements within the text is to use a minimum of means for maximum results. And that includes keeping it consistent and not trying to emphasize too many different things within the text, because again, that becomes confusing. And also not using, unless you feel like it's needed, but usually you only need one way of emphasizing. So you don't need it to be bold and larger, for example. You don't need to underline it and use italics, or hopefully you're not underlining it at all. But try to use the minimum of means to get the point across that you're trying to do. And then again, keep in mind how things can affect the leading if you are changing if you're changing the font. So for example, let's say that I wanted to emphasize this word right here, this gibberish word right here in the text. And if I just add oblique to it, it stands out, right? You can kind of see it, you kind of notice it. If I made it bold, you would notice it. But if I made it larger, let's see what happens if I just decided I wanted to make it larger. It starts interfering with the top and the bottom of the text right there. If I'm putting a different font in here, then it can really kind of change things too. It actually didn't do it here, but many times a different font will have a different automatic leading set, so it will kind of start messing with your leading. Let's see what happens if this one is a little bit bolder. Okay, and you can see that either it will adjust the leading or it will start interfering with lines above and below. All right, so rule number 17, we are remembering that, and we're just re-emphasizing it, that you never ever squish or stretch text. It's a bad, bad, bad thing, and it's going to be something that if it's ever in your portfolio pieces or in your assignments, you're going to be docked points, or in your portfolio, it's even worse, because then you're going to get kind of a stamp of disapproval from anyone who's looking at it. And this is something that that professionals pick up very quickly and very easily. You might not notice it as much. Sometimes you might even do it unintentionally, and you didn't even know that you accidentally stretched or squished some text. But as your eye becomes more and more trained, you'll be able to pinpoint that distorted text very quickly. All right, so rule number 18 talks about aligning letters and words on the baseline. And we talked a little bit about baseline grid before. And you want to, it's nice to have that alignment where the text is aligned across columns and so forth on the same baseline. If you're using type on a path, you want to make sure that you use it with skill or a purpose, and you use carefully selected fonts. And we're going to look more at, those kinds of things with type on a path and things like that next week. If you need it, there is an option to use the baseline shift for special situations. And that is found in your character panel. And so let's see what it does to, you know, a little word right here. If you have your baseline shift over here, either up or down. So if I move it up, it's going to move that word up away from the rest of the words. If I move it down, it can move it down below. Sometimes you can use this when you need to manually create some special characters, or if you're doing something, I don't know, something unusual where this is an effect that you need. But that's where that baseline shift is at, but it's something that you shouldn't use just randomly. You know, the baseline is there for a purpose. Okay, so rule number 19, our last rule, talks about working with color and making sure that we have sufficient contrast between the type and its background. If you have not enough contrast in hue, which means the color of the two different colors that are combined here, the value, which means how dark or light it is, or how saturated, in other words, how intense it is, it can result in type that is impossible to read. And this also is something that you probably learn in your color theory class a little bit more in, whether you have been through that or not yet. But colors with the same saturation will really fight for attention. And so it's important that you have one of the colors, again, take the obvious lead, as in any time that you pair different design elements, that contrast is important. Here are some examples. You can see that both this bright yellow color and the bright blue color, they're both bright, even though the yellow is lighter, so to speak. They're both really bright, and it starts kind of vibrating and being difficult to read. But if you desaturate the yellow and make it softer and lighter, it falls into the background more, and the text on top of it becomes easier to read. Here with the red and blue example, you have a couple of colors that are very close in value. In other words, they're about the same dark. So even though this color is lighter, it's still the same saturation. Over here, the red color and the blue color are about the same darkness. The blue might be a little bit darker, but because they're so close in their value, it becomes difficult to read. But if you have one of the colors, and in this instance, we made the text lighter, then it becomes easier to read. You just need to let one of them take the obvious lead. And many times, I think the biggest problem happens when the background color is too bright. So something to keep in mind, unless you want this kind of reverse look where the text is lighter than the background, is keep in mind that it's called the background for a reason. It needs to stay in the back. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about organizing our text and what techniques of the different things that we've learned about, how we can use those in different techniques to organize text. When you have some information and text, it's important that you're able to organize it and create some kind of hierarchy and order in that text so that you can control how the audience reads it and what type of information they notice first, second, and third. And you have some powerful tools that you can use to kind of guide the reader through the material. You can use different fonts and styles. You can use line breaks like we've talked about, and alignments and spacing. So let's take a look at the hierarchy of text. Now that, like I mentioned, that's the order that people read things. And usually we read things from top to bottom, or from largest to smallest. So you can see in this one example from the top to the bottom, we kind of read the word hierarchy first, and then the things that are below that, and also in smaller sizes. On the example on the right, though, you can see that we are not noticing the top things first. We are noticing something in the middle because they have used a larger type, and they have also pushed it out of alignment so it has some kind of contrast and stands out. And then we see the stuff down here, the time and the place, for in our second tier of hierarchy. And then the other things, even the stuff on top and on the bottom, becomes apparent to us, and we start reading that. So the designer can control how the person reads the text, and it can also introduce all kinds of variety and interest into some text by using some of these typographical techniques. So we're going to look at 5 different ways to create hierarchy and order in text. We're going to use line breaks, we're going to use font contrast and combinations, font sizes and styles, leading, or in other words, line spacing, to group our text, and then we're going to also use some color. Let's take a look at a piece of information here. All right, so here we have a little piece of information, just some stuff that is supposed to go on a flyer or a poster, possibly, about an activity at an elementary school. So we have a little bit of information right here. Let's try to see how we can use some of these techniques to organize this information and make it a little bit more palatable to our audience. I doubt anybody would read this or pay much attention to it if this is all that was on the poster. So we have the first thing right here, Jefferson Elementary School Fall Festival. So we can start dividing these into different lines depending on the content. So this is the fundraiser. Then we have the date and where it is at. Then we have some information on all the kind of fun things that you can do, and then there is some ticket information in there, and that accidentally happened to be on a separate line just because of the way our text box is right here. So we're going to put in a specific line break right there to make sure that the ticket price is on a separate line. All right, so now that we have started separating this, we can start adding a little bit of contrast and some sizing to this information so that we can see what is the most important parts. So the Fall Festival fundraiser, that I would say would be kind of the most important thing here. So we're gonna make that a lot bigger, okay? Now it seems like these things don't really belong on the same line anymore, so we probably need to put in another break right there, just kind of introduce the school right here. So the Fall Festival fundraiser is most important. Second important, we can take the dates, and so we will add a little bit of size to that as well. And we have to make our box a little bit bigger. Okay, so now we have created some order because of size, and we have organized the text with some line breaks. The other thing that can also help enhance some of this hierarchy is to use different fonts or different styles of text. So maybe we want them to really see the date and the time, so we can use kind of our bolded versions of the text right there so that stands out a little bit more. And we can combine fonts and have 2 different fonts together to emphasize the Fall Festival fundraiser. And that would also actually give us a little bit more variety and interest in here. So This is a time when you can probably use a little bit more decorative font, or you can use a contrasting font like a serif, since the rest of our text is sans serif. So I'm just going to choose this serif text right here to make that distinction and make these two pieces of text feel very different. So once we have done that, we might want to group our text a little bit more. We've already started making some big differences between, you know, this just one paragraph here and the text where it is here. But we probably want to space things out just a little bit more. So I'm going to add some extra space. Now you can do that by doing a return in your text, so that I'm kind of spacing this. And this depends on the size of your document, the space that you have to work with, you know, whether it's vertical or horizontal, all of those different things. But you can do it versus a return in your text, or you can also use your leading in your characters panel to adjust things a little bit if you need to as well. Right, so here we are. We've used some leading and grouping some text together, separating the things that can stand alone a little bit more and that are larger. And then we can also use color to kind of emphasize things. So maybe the Fall Festival fundraiser, that would be fun to add some color to that. And of course, that depends on your options when it comes to printing and things like that. So now we have our information a lot more organized. And then depending on your format, again, you might want to use different types of alignments to have certain things stand out. Like we saw in our example, we had one where the main line or the main subject of the information was offset from the rest. So you can do that, and you can use your paragraph panel to do that, and do it in your indentations right here, where you can do a left indent or a right indent for some of your text. So you would just have to highlight that. So if you wanted to left indent some of this, you'd probably have to go in here and, you know, maybe we set that at 56. So then we want to do the same to this text. And that way, the Fall Festival right here is sticking out and being a little bit more obvious that way. Or if we go back to where we were, we can just do a totally separate alignment for a center alignment, for example. And I was going to do that to all of it. Let me select the whole text box and do it to all of it. And now you can see that our lines are looking a little bit more different, and everything feels more separated. But this long line right here is not looking too good right now. We have a widow hanging out right here, right? So then you're going to have to go in and make adjustments again. And maybe just make a line break someplace where it feels like those two lines become a little bit more even. And since it's a list, it's not a big deal really where I put that. But if you have a sentence right here, you want to think about making a line break maybe right after a comma, or where it's a good place to pause as people are looking through the information. You could also put the time on a separate line. And then, you know, then the time, the date and the time becomes its own group. So if you need to move things further apart or closer together with your leading, you can do that, but you want to make sure that any information that kind of belongs together stays together. Next, let's take a look at a few things that will really add that special professional touch. And those are special characters. And this is really when your type knowledge will show, or your lack of type knowledge will show as well. So these are the finer details that trained eyes will look for. So when we're talking about special characters, there are quite a few, but I'm just going to mention some of the basics. In your characters panel options, you can find small caps. Now, small caps are used, should technically be used for times like AM and PM, and sometimes for acronyms and things like that in text. You can also find a superscript, which lifts the text up a little bit, and that is for dates and ordering. And subscripts, which are usually only used for math. And then in under type and special characters in both InDesign and Illustrator, you can find different types of hyphens. There's N dash and M dash. There's also some shortcut keys for these that you can learn that become easier after a little while. And there's also specific quotation marks that you need to be using, either open and close marks, and they're different from inch marks. And there's actually a setting that you can put on there that's called smart quotes that can really help you have it all happen automatically. But you can also find these quotation marks in the glyphs if you need to. So let's take a look at how these work and function. And we're going to use our invitation here to demonstrate some of these. Okay, so let's open up our character panel right here. And in this little extra menu right here, you'll see that there's a few different things. So we have all caps, small caps. We have all of those different options right here. So we have a time in our document right here. So I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to go to small caps. And then I'm actually going to take off the period because it becomes a little annoying. So now you can see that that is actually different from if I had regular caps. See how large those are? So they really dominate the text too much. So these small caps makes it so that this time stamp right here does not take over as far as emphasis and hierarchy is concerned. The next one we're going to look at is the superscript. And so that was also available here, and that we're going to use for the TF in October 10th. It's used for ordering. So we're going to go here, we're going to do superscript. You can see how that, I'm going to take out the period again, how that makes it smaller and bumps it up. Now you can do that manually if you want to by changing the size of the type and using your baseline shift to move it up. Let's see, it's, if I have it like this, I could actually manually do it by making it smaller. And then moving it up with the baseline shift. But this way, you have it just inserted and automatically becoming that superscript. A subscript actually takes it below the baseline, and that's usually just used for math, like square roots and things like that. So. But that's available to you if you need it right there. The next thing we're going to look at are our hyphens. And so we have a hyphen right here that shows duration. And there's actually 3 types of hyphens that should be used in text. There is this regular one that should be just used as a hyphen in text, like it is right here under fundraiser, and that's what's been used here. It's actually incorrect. The correct one to use right here is an N dash, and it's about the width of the letter N. And you can find that under type, and insert special characters, and then hyphens and dashes. And there you can see M dash and N dash. And M dash is a little bit longer. It's the size of an M. And so that one is actually used for pausing, you know, before thoughts and things like that in text. But the N dash If I insert that, you can see that's a little bit longer. Let me show you what the M dash looks like too. So that's even longer. And there's some shortcut keys for these that you can learn as well. But the N dash is the one that's supposed to be used for duration of time. This one right here would be introduced in text if you're changing a thought or something like that. So now I've corrected that and I have the correct dash in there. You can also see here on our quotation marks that these are actually automatically come in there. They are the correct quotation marks because they are they're upside down from each other, and so it's an opening and closing quote. Sometimes you might run into inch marks instead that look the same on both sides, and then you have to make changes for that. You can do that also in the special characters. You can see that there's quotation marks right here, double left and right, and single left and right. So you can use those correctly. The smart punctuation option right here in your type gives you a little menu where you can actually choose these to be automatically added. So you can choose ligatures where the letters that are F's and I's kind of close in together. You can make sure that you have the right dashes, smart quotes, and smart spacing, which also kind of fine tunes your punctuation. So that's a good thing to kind of turn on those different smart punctuation. You can also turn on the ellipses. That makes the ellipses or the three dots together spaced just perfectly. And you can have it added to the entire document or just the selected text. Now, if you don't remember to do all of these little things, I know these are a lot of details, don't be too concerned. There's many ways to do the same thing, and you can always find web searches, tutorials, and review the class materials to remember how to do this. The important thing is that you remember that you should do it, so that when you encounter dates, times, and hyphens and quotation marks, you take a specific look at that to make sure that you're using the right character, so that your typography can be fine-tuned and look really professional. And with practice, you'll get used to doing it with shortcut keys as well. Our next topic is monograms. Monograms consist of two or more letters that are combined into one unit. They're often intertwined and have sometimes decorative elements. They're used for logos or sometimes for personal or family marks. And it's a really good opportunity to use script or decorative fonts. You can see a couple of examples right here, one from the University of Texas and another one that's a regal mark, and that's a place where monograms are often used. So when you're trying to create a monogram, the key is really the font that you're using. You are limited to specific letter forms, so you have to look at those specific letters in the different fonts, and you have to look at them as shapes so that you can look for different shapes that will connect, and how those two or three letters that you have can be combined to create one new unit. Legibility is less of an issue here, so you really get the opportunity to look at letters as shapes and create some type of design from this. Let's do a little bit of a demonstration on it, but you can also look for samples and inspiration to kind of help and guide you through web searches, Pinterest, all kinds of other places. All right, so here in my other document, I have a couple of letters that we're going to use for our sample. And I have chosen a script font for this first option right here, but you need to think about the mood of the font. You know, is the script font really the one that is going to be functional for this? Or, you know, what type of a company is it? What type of font is going to fit the mood and the style of this monogram the best? It might be a script font, it might be a simple sans serif, or a traditional serif font. So once you have your font selected, you can actually go and look through different options in your character panel, if you highlight it, let's see here, even if I have a script font, two different script fonts might look quite different. So if I check out, if I take a look at my different fonts right here, I can actually filter them up here to look at only script fonts, for example. And as I go through here and kind of scroll through, you can see that these two letters are very different depending on the font. So, you know, you're going to have completely different shapes to choose from. So it's a good thing to probably try a few different options and work with each one of them and see how they work together. Once you have your font option selected, I would suggest that you create a copy of this document so that you have several to work with. But you can use your touch type tool right here. And when you select either one of these letters with the touch type tool, they become separated. And so you can kind of move them and arrange them, and you can even highlight them and try different fonts because they still act like text. So that's kind of a nice way to start working with these. And you can see that these two options right here are going to work quite differently when I start to overlap them, and you know how the different curly cues and stuff like that will interact with each one of the letters. You can also size them with the touch type tool. So if one needs to be a little bit larger than the other so that the curls just kind of fit really nicely together, you can do that. You can rotate them as well, but be careful what happens when you rotate things. It might not always turn out so nicely with monograms. Your other option is to create outlines from your text. Then you have a little bit more control. If you select your text and you go under Type and Create Outlines, or you can also go under Object and Expand, then you have two different separate items, and they're actually not text anymore, they're just objects. You'll have to ungroup them to move them separately. But once you have done that, you have lost the ability to change, to see what character it is, what font it is, and to change the font. So this is where it's good to have a backup document where you have everything labeled with the font that you're using, so you can go back to that. But once you have the letters as outlines, then you have a little bit more freedom, and you can start playing with the different arrangements of the text. And you can see as you know, as you either overlap things just a little bit or just move them closer together. You can also kind of, if overlapping doesn't work, maybe just having a couple of different sizes that fit together will be helpful to you. And then it's kind of up to your creative eye and thinking about how those different letter forms can work together as shapes to create a successful monogram. So keep in mind that the sizes of your letter forms will impact this, and you really have to just try different fonts, see how they will work together. Sometimes you have to size one letter a little bit larger than the other to make specific parts of the letter fit in with another one. And it really becomes a fun and a creative process to do this. But you're going to have to play with it a lot. You're going to have to try different things. And you're going to definitely have to be able to move each one of the letter forms separately, either with a touch type tool or by creating outlines of them and having them as objects. So I recommended that you look at some inspiration as you start, working with logos or working with anything with type. There is so much inspiration out there from looking at Behance, Pinterest, web searches, or blogs. You learn a lot from looking at things. The more you see, the more you'll know, and you'll get ideas and come up with solutions that you might not have been able to find otherwise. So don't just rely on what's right before you. but the more inspiration you search, it will gather up a great library of references in your mind, and you'll find your creativity growing, and also your sense of style and design will be developed by looking at inspiration and analyzing the things that you see and evaluating them against some of the things that you've learned in this class.